Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of week 3 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist, and we continue to talk about the Protagoras. Early in the conversation, Socrates and Protagoras were already talking about the unity of the virtues. That is this idea that someone who has one of the virtues must also have the others. And that is the position that Socrates defends, or at least suggests that he is inclined to hold that view, whereas Protagoras has committed himself to thinking that the virtues are parts of a whole, but parts that are quite different, parts that are different kind of in the way in which, say, the eyes and ears and other parts of a face differ from each other. So quite different. And he thinks that someone can have one or some of the virtues without having all of them. So he denies this claim or view that is called the unity of the virtues. Now, after discussion of a couple of other things, including the interpretation of this poem by Similarity and becoming good versus being good, Socrates and Protagoras return to the unity of the virtues. And they return to a dimension of it that, in my view, is a very important one and is something that Plato revisits in the Republic and takes very seriously. And that is the question of whether courage fits in. So I want to say a little bit just about, what is the scope of the virtues, and invite you to think a little bit about which kinds of virtues are going to be part of this claim, the unity of the virtues, or of the discussion about whether the unity of the virtues holds. In the Republic, famously, Plato discusses 4 virtues: justice, courage, moderation, and wisdom. And these virtues are sometimes called cardinal virtues, and they have found a lot of attention in the scholarship, but also in contemporary virtue ethics. Now, it is not a given for Plato that those are the virtues. Those 4 virtues are the ones that we should be interested in. On the contrary, some of the earlier dialogues discuss other virtues, and it is not necessarily plausible to assume that simply because in the Republic, Plato focuses on wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, that therefore he now thinks that other virtues aren't so important. So, for example, we might think that piety, which is discussed in the Euthyphro, could still be a virtue, even in late dialogues that Plato takes quite seriously. Now, in some of the early dialogues, in particular the Euthyphro and the Meno, there is a consideration that bears somewhat on the discussion about the unity of the virtues. And I want to just briefly mention this. Namely, it could seem that some virtues, even though they don't seem to be all of virtue, somehow are extremely generalized and maybe bear on all of a person's actions and motivations. So, for example, the Euthyphro is about piety or the pious. And there is a way of thinking about the pious where everything that a person does, which is good and right and virtuous, is also pious. In the Meno, Socrates' interlocutor, Meno, keeps confusing whether justice is a virtue, part of virtue, or simply virtue. He kind of uses justice at times as equivalent with virtue. And you can see that there might be this intuition that, justice is something like doing the right thing. And if being virtuous is something like being a good person, then maybe the good person is the person who does the right thing, or has the relevant motivations. So it could seem that some of the virtues are actually by themselves very close to something like all of virtue, and yet Plato thinks, well, they aren't all of virtue, they are a virtue, but not virtue, and as the whole of virtue. Now, when in the Protagoras and Socrates return to the question of the unity of the virtues, Socrates gives us a list of 5 virtues, and they are the 4 ones from the Republic: wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation, but they also include piety. And he asks Protagoras again, well, do you think that each of them is one thing, pragma, with its own nature? And Protagoras says yes. But then he picks up on something, on a notion that Socrates introduced earlier, namely the notion of similarity. And he says, well, one thing that he thinks is very important is that 4 of these 5 virtues seem really nearby, very similar to each other: wisdom, justice, piety, and moderation. And one can think of this as sort of this idea that maybe a person who has, who is moderate is also not going to keep everything to herself. So that feeds into being just and distributing stuff in the right kind of way. And it also feeds into being wise, because wisdom maybe also goes along with these more quiet and temperate kinds of attitudes. And then maybe another way to describe her actions is that they are pious and respectful of divinity, and so on and so forth. But the 5th virtue, courage, Protagoras says, simply doesn't fit in. It is not similar. And that is an argument against the unity of the virtues, which is a quite general argument, namely to say, well, if there is even just one virtue that somehow seems to be an outlier, pulling in a different direction, then it's not going to be compelling that someone who has one of the virtues has all of them, or at least there's going to be an uphill battle to argue for that. Because it may seem that someone who has the temperament, say the natural predisposition to become courageous, simply doesn't have the same temperament that someone has who is inclined or predisposed to become wise and moderate and just, and so on. Now, I want to invite you to take that issue in the Protagoras very seriously, even though it is not Socrates' but Protagoras' position that we are discussing here. In the Republic, Plato returns to this and devises a kind of educational system that is truly kind of calibrated towards finding the right kind of integration between the more wild and spirited kinds of aspects of someone's psychology with the milder and quieter and thinking inclined kinds of aspects of someone's psychology. And he does acknowledge that that is somehow the hardest. How to balance those tendencies in our psychology, and then in effect, how to combine courage and those quieter virtues on the other side. So that becomes truly one of the core ideas in the Republic, and that should warn us from moving too quickly here in the Protagoras. Instead, we should see that Protagoras is maybe indeed drawing our attention to a genuine feature of human psychology, namely that some of us are more inclined to become courageous or better at becoming courageous than others, and others are better at becoming just and moderate and wise. But to have the combination for both may indeed be truly hard.